A millionaire CEO stopped when a little girl tugged his jacket and said, "Can you teach me how to earn money?" He had no idea those words would change his life forever. The lobby of the business center was a place where everything seemed to move too fast, where the sound of high heels on marble floors mixed with the constant hum of conversations and the echo of elevator doors opening and closing. Among the people in tailored suits and designer shoes stood a little girl, no taller than the reception desk, with blonde curls falling over her shoulders and a yellow dress that was slightly wrinkled from the long walk. Her name was Lily. She clutched an old, worn-out plush toy in one hand and looked around with the cautious curiosity of someone who didn't belong in such a shiny, expensive world. Her blue eyes followed every adult who passed her, every confident face that didn't even glance her way. She wasn't lost, she was waiting for courage. Michael, a man in his mid-30s with dark brown hair neatly combed back and cold blue eyes that usually missed nothing, was standing near the reception desk speaking quietly with his assistant. His light blue suit looked like it had been made just for him, and it probably was. He was the CEO of a multinational company, a man whose time was measured in profit margins and market shares, not moments of silence. But for the first time in weeks, he wasn't thinking about business. He was distracted by a small tug at the sleeve of his jacket. When he turned, his gaze met the serious, unblinking eyes of the little girl. Lily tilted her head slightly and asked in a soft, steady voice that sounded far too mature for her age, "Can you teach me how to earn money?" Michael blinked, unsure if he'd heard her correctly. He'd been approached by investors, reporters, and employees asking for help, but never by a child with such direct honesty. He knelt down, his polished shoes squeaking slightly against the marble, and looked at her more closely. She didn't seem scared. She wasn't begging or asking for something free. Her small hands were trembling slightly, but her expression was filled with determination. "Why do you want to earn money?" he asked, his tone more gentle than he expected it to be. Lily looked down at her shoes for a moment, then back at him. "Because my mom is sick," she said simply. "She needs medicine, but we don't have money for it. I don't want anyone to give it to me. I just want to earn it myself." The words hit him harder than any corporate loss ever had. There was no pity in her voice, only resolve, and that made it all the more painful. Michael swallowed, trying to hide the lump forming in his throat. He had seen poverty before, read about it in reports, donated to charities run by his own foundation, but standing in front of this small girl made all those numbers suddenly human. He asked her name, and she said, "Lily." Then she smiled faintly, as if worried he might think her request was silly. But he didn't. For some reason he couldn't explain, her presence unsettled him. The child reminded him of something he had long buried, memories of his own mother working late into the night, her tired hands sorting through bills at the kitchen table, her smile growing weaker with every passing year. He remembered promising himself that when he grew up, he would never be poor again, never feel helpless. Yet now, looking at Lily, he realized that being rich didn't mean he understood happiness any better. The receptionist, unsure how to react, glanced nervously between them, but Michael raised his hand, signaling her to stay quiet. He asked Lily where she lived, and she pointed toward the window. "Not far," she said. "Behind the big park. Our house is old, but it's okay." He could tell by the way she said it that it wasn't okay at all. He straightened slowly and took out his phone. "I'll take you home," he said quietly, and when she opened her mouth to protest, he added, "Not because I pity you. Because I want to know where you live. Maybe I can help your mother." For a moment, Lily hesitated. She had learned not to trust strangers, especially those who spoke kindly, because kindness often faded when people learned the truth about her life. But there was something different about this man. His eyes weren't just blue, they were tired, like he understood something about loneliness. Finally, she nodded. Okay, she said softly. When they left the building together, people in the lobby watched with curiosity. A powerful CEO walking beside a small child holding a ragged toy, it looked strange, even out of place. But for Michael, it felt strangely natural. As they stepped outside, the wind picked up, and Lily's curls danced in the cold air. He opened the car door for her, and she climbed in carefully, her feet barely reaching the seat. She looked around the luxurious interior and whispered, "It smells like new books." Michael smiled faintly. "That's leather," he said, but her comparison somehow felt better. During the drive, she sat quietly, looking out the window. Every time the car stopped at a red light, Michael found himself glancing at her reflection in the glass. There was something haunting about the way she watched the world, not with excitement, but with a calm sadness, as if she already understood too much about how unfair life could be. He didn't know why, but in that silence, something inside him shifted. For years, he had lived surrounded by wealth, success, and admiration, yet all of it felt hollow compared to this quiet, brave child sitting beside him. He didn't realize it then, but this moment, this small encounter in the middle of an ordinary day, would change both their lives forever. The road stretched beyond the city limits, where tall glass towers gave way to small houses and worn-out fences that leaned from years of neglect. The closer they got to Lily's neighborhood, the more Michael felt the contrast pressing against him like a weight he couldn't ignore. He had driven through these parts before, always with the tinted windows rolled up, his mind buried in meetings and deals. But now, with the little girl sitting quietly beside him, her small hands folded neatly in her lap, every crack in the pavement and every abandoned yard seemed louder, more accusing. Lily hummed softly to herself, the kind of quiet sound a child makes when she's trying to distract herself from fear. Occasionally, she glanced at him as if to make sure he wasn't angry or impatient. When they finally stopped in front of a small, faded house at the edge of a gravel road, Michael felt his chest tighten. The roof sagged slightly, and the windows were patched with pieces of plastic instead of glass. A pale curtain swayed inside from a draft that leaked through the cracks. Lily jumped out of the car, clutching her toy rabbit against her chest, and ran to the front door. "Mom! I'm home," she called out. Her voice carried through the air, but for a moment there was no answer. Then a faint voice responded from inside, weak but warm. "Lily, sweetheart, is that you?" Michael followed her slowly, feeling strangely nervous as he stepped onto the porch that creaked under his shoes. Inside, the smell of medicine and dampness filled the air. The house was dimly lit, and the wallpaper peeled in several places, revealing old wood beneath. A woman lay on a narrow bed near the window, her face pale and tired, but when she saw her daughter, her eyes lit up. She was beautiful in a fragile, exhausted way, the kind of beauty that pain couldn't erase. Lily rushed to her and threw her arms around her. "Mom, look! I met someone. He's going to teach me how to earn money." The woman blinked, confused, and then looked up at Michael standing awkwardly in the doorway. "I'm sorry," she said in a quiet voice. "She must have bothered you. Lily has a big imagination." Michael shook his head quickly. "No, she didn't bother me. She just surprised me." He hesitated, then stepped closer. "My name is Michael. I met your daughter at the business center downtown. She told me you weren't well." The woman's expression softened with embarrassment. "I didn't want her to worry anyone," she murmured. "She's all I have. And I suppose she's been trying to help." She smiled weakly and brushed a strand of hair from Lily's face. "You're too kind to stop for her. Most people wouldn't." Michael looked around the room. There were prescription bottles on a small table, a few pieces of bread wrapped in a napkin, and a cup of tea that had long gone cold. He had seen poverty in statistics, in spreadsheets, in charity reports, but this was different. This had a smell, a sound, a face. "When was the last time you saw a doctor?" he asked quietly. Sarah, he learned her name only when Lily said it, looked down at her hands. "A few months ago. They said I need surgery. It's expensive. I'm just waiting." Michael didn't ask what she was waiting for, he already knew. People like her waited for miracles that rarely came. Lily sat beside her mother, holding her hand and smiling proudly. "Mom, he has a big office. And people listen to him. I told him I want to work, and he said he'll teach me." Sarah's lips trembled as she tried to keep her composure. "Lily," she said gently, "you can't bother him like that." But Michael interrupted her softly. "She didn't bother me. In fact, she reminded me of something important." He took a step closer, lowering his voice so that it sounded less like an offer and more like a promise. "Let me help you. I can cover the treatment, and you can repay me when you're better, if that makes it easier. You don't have to face this alone." Sarah shook her head almost immediately, a flash of pride in her tired eyes. "I don't want charity. I just want to work. I was an accountant before I got sick. If you ever need someone part-time." Her voice faded, but the determination remained. Michael felt a strange respect for her. It wasn't about stubbornness, it was dignity, something he hadn't seen in a long time, even among the wealthy. He nodded. "Then consider it a job offer," he said. "I'll arrange everything." Lily's eyes widened in delight. "Mom, see? You can work again." She hugged her mother tightly, and for a moment the small room seemed a little brighter. Sarah looked at Michael with tears in her eyes but said nothing. There was a silence between them, not uncomfortable but heavy with understanding. When he finally left, the evening air felt colder than before. As he walked toward his car, he turned back once and saw Lily standing at the window, waving at him with her toy rabbit in hand. Driving back through the city lights, Michael couldn't stop thinking about them, the fragile mother, the brave little girl, the house that looked like it could collapse at any moment but still held warmth. In his office, people often told him success was about numbers, but tonight, staring at the reflection of the city in his windshield, he began to wonder if maybe he had been chasing the wrong kind of success all along. That night, for the first time in years, he couldn't fall asleep. The image of Lily's small hand tugging at his sleeve replayed in his mind over and over again, and the echo of her voice, "I want to learn how to earn money," felt less like a request and more like a challenge to the man he had become. The following morning began like any other for Michael, but something in him had shifted. His usual routine, coffee at 7, meetings at 8, calls at 9, felt hollow and mechanical, as if his body was moving through the motions while his mind lingered somewhere else entirely. He sat behind his enormous desk overlooking the skyline, the city glowing beneath the rising sun, yet all he could think about was the small house on the edge of town and the girl who had looked at him with eyes too old for her age. His assistant entered with a stack of documents and started briefing him on upcoming negotiations, but he found himself tuning out halfway through. When she paused to ask for his approval, he simply nodded, realizing he hadn't heard a single word she said. By noon, he made up his mind. He told his assistant to cancel his afternoon appointments and drove back toward the neighborhood where Lily and her mother lived. The road seemed shorter this time, maybe because he already knew what waited for him at the end. He didn't bring anything grand or ostentatious, just a small bag of groceries and some medicine he had asked his company's doctor to recommend. When he knocked on the door, it took a moment before it opened, revealing Lily's curious face peeking out from behind it. Her expression shifted from surprise to delight the instant she recognized him. "You came back," she exclaimed, and without hesitation, she pulled him inside as if he were a long-lost friend instead of a powerful stranger. Sarah was sitting at the table, pale but more alert than the day before. She tried to stand when she saw him, but he gestured for her to stay seated. "I told you I'd be back," he said quietly, setting the groceries on the table. "I wanted to make sure you were all right." Sarah looked at the bags, then at him, her eyes glistening with unspoken gratitude and discomfort. "You really didn't have to do that," she murmured. "We've managed before." Michael smiled faintly, though there was sadness behind it. "Just because you managed doesn't mean you should have to," he replied. For a moment, she said nothing, and then she looked down, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. Lily climbed onto a chair beside her mother, swinging her legs back and forth. "Can I come to your office today?" she asked suddenly. Michael hesitated, unsure how to answer, but her excitement was contagious. "I thought maybe you could show me how to earn money like you promised," she continued earnestly. Sarah looked startled. "Lily, he's a busy man. You can't just," but Michael interrupted her gently. "Actually, she can. At least for a little while." Sarah blinked at him, unsure if he was serious, but the warmth in his tone convinced her. "Just for a few hours," he added. "She can see what work really looks like." When they arrived at the company later that day, the reactions were almost comical. Employees who had only ever seen Michael in board meetings or through emails stopped and stared as he walked in holding the hand of a small blonde girl wearing a yellow dress and carrying a stuffed rabbit. He could feel the confusion radiating through the office, but he didn't care. Lily looked around with wide eyes, fascinated by everything: the tall glass walls, the computers, the steady hum of printers and voices. To her, it wasn't just an office, it was a new world. Michael led her to his desk, which suddenly looked less impressive under her curious gaze. He showed her papers, explained that these were the things grown-ups used to plan, build, and create jobs. Of course, she didn't understand most of it, but she listened intently, nodding as if it were the most important lesson she'd ever had. When his secretary brought in coffee, Lily asked shyly if she could help. Within minutes, she was carrying small cups from one desk to another, careful not to spill, her little brow furrowed in concentration. Everyone smiled as they watched her, some even helping her reach the higher tables. The energy in the office began to shift. Where there had once been tension and monotony, there was now laughter and lightness. Michael observed it all quietly. He hadn't expected something so simple to change the atmosphere so dramatically. For years, he had built his company on discipline, precision, and control, but now this small child had accomplished something he never could: she had made people feel alive again. When she finally sat beside him, tired but happy, she looked up at him and asked, "Did I earn money today?" He chuckled softly. "You earned something better," he said. "You made everyone here smile." She thought about it seriously, then nodded as if she understood. That evening, as he drove her home, she fell asleep in the back seat, the stuffed rabbit resting in her arms. The city lights reflected softly against her face, and for the first time in years, Michael felt something like peace. When he carried her to the door, Sarah opened it and gasped softly. "You didn't have to bring her back yourself," she whispered. "She's exhausted." Michael smiled. "She worked hard today," he said quietly. "She earned it." He gently placed Lily on the couch and covered her with a blanket. Before leaving, he turned to Sarah and said, "You raised an extraordinary daughter." Sarah looked at him, her eyes full of gratitude and confusion, as if she couldn't understand why someone like him cared so much. "She reminds me of what matters," he added, almost to himself. Then he left, stepping out into the cold evening air, his thoughts tangled and heavy. The sound of his footsteps echoed against the pavement, but all he could hear was the small voice from earlier that day: "Did I earn money today?" He realized that perhaps she was the one teaching him what it meant to truly earn something real, not through power or wealth, but through kindness and connection. The next few weeks passed in a strange rhythm that felt both new and familiar to Michael. He still went to his meetings, reviewed reports, and made decisions that affected thousands of people, but the part of his day that he began to look forward to the most was no longer at his office or in his boardroom. It was the brief visits he made to the small house at the edge of town. Every few days, he stopped by to bring groceries or medicine, to check on Sarah, and to spend time with Lily, who had somehow become the only person capable of breaking through the carefully built walls of his life. Sometimes she would wait for him outside, sitting on the porch with her toy rabbit in her lap, her face lighting up the moment his car appeared at the end of the road. One afternoon, when he arrived earlier than usual, he found Sarah sitting in a chair by the window, reading an old book while Lily colored pictures on the floor. The room still carried that quiet sadness, but there was also a new kind of warmth in it, a sense of hope trying to grow despite everything. Sarah looked up when he entered, a gentle smile touching her lips. "You're becoming quite a regular guest," she said softly. "My daughter thinks you're some kind of hero." Michael chuckled quietly. "I think she's the hero," he replied. "She's the bravest person I've met." They talked for a while, the kind of simple conversation that felt easy but carried weight beneath the surface. She told him about her old job, about how she used to dream of running her own accounting firm, and how life had slowly taken that dream apart. He listened more than he spoke, something that surprised even him. Usually, his conversations were filled with strategies, solutions, and results, but here he didn't need to fix anything, he just needed to listen. Every time she laughed softly, it felt like a victory against the shadows that had surrounded her for so long. Later, Lily ran up to him holding one of her drawings. It was a messy but colorful picture of a tall man in a blue suit standing beside a small girl holding a rabbit. "That's you and me," she said proudly. "We're business partners." He smiled, taking the drawing from her small hands as if it were something sacred. "The best partnership I've ever had," he said. Sarah watched the exchange quietly, her eyes soft but distant. For the first time, she allowed herself to hope that maybe things could get better. Over the next few days, Michael arranged for Sarah to start working remotely for his company's finance department. She was hesitant at first, but he insisted that she was doing him a favor, not the other way around. She worked from home, her laptop balanced on a small kitchen table, slowly finding purpose again. Her color began to return, and Lily noticed it too. "You smile more now," she said one morning while brushing her mother's hair. Sarah kissed her forehead. "Maybe that's because someone reminded me that life isn't over yet." Meanwhile, at the company, people began to notice changes in Michael as well. He was still strict, still demanding, but his tone had softened, and there was a kind of patience in him that no one had seen before. The once distant, untouchable CEO now took time to ask how people were doing, to listen instead of command. He didn't talk about Lily or Sarah, but everyone could tell that something, or someone, had reached the part of him that business had long buried. One evening, after finishing a long day of work, Michael drove back to the small house, but when he arrived, the lights were off. Panic gripped him for a moment until he saw a figure sitting on the porch. It was Sarah, wrapped in a blanket, looking up at the night sky. She smiled when she saw him and gestured for him to sit. "Lily's asleep," she said softly. "She spent all afternoon pretending to run an office. She even made me her assistant." Michael laughed quietly, but there was something heavy in his chest as he looked at her. "She reminds me what it's like to believe in something," he said. Sarah nodded slowly. "Children do that. They make you see what you've forgotten." There was silence between them for a while, but it wasn't awkward. It was the kind of silence that only existed between two people who didn't need words to understand each other. The air was cool, and the faint hum of crickets filled the night. Then Sarah spoke again, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't know why you're doing all this for us, Michael. You don't owe us anything. But I need you to know that whatever happens, I'm grateful. He turned to her, his expression unreadable. You don't owe me gratitude, he said. You and your daughter gave me something I didn't realize I'd lost. She looked at him questioningly. And what's that? He exhaled slowly. A reason. For the first time in a long while, Michael stayed. They sat together on the porch as the stars brightened above them, talking about everything and nothing until the night faded into quiet. When he finally left, he glanced back at the small house and saw the faint glow of a light turn on inside. It was such a simple thing, but to him, it felt like a symbol, that maybe life had finally started to return to that place. As he drove home, the city lights shimmered like a distant dream, but he no longer felt drawn to them. What mattered now wasn't the skyline or the success waiting in his penthouse, it was the laughter of a small girl and the strength of her mother, who had somehow managed to show him that the world was still capable of kindness. And though he didn't know it yet, that night marked the beginning of something much deeper, something that would test him, change him, and ultimately lead him toward a kind of happiness he'd never known before. Winter began to settle over the city, the kind of cold that seeped into the bones and made everything slower, quieter, more fragile. Michael had never noticed how heavy the season felt before. His life used to move too quickly for weather to matter, chauffeurs, heated offices, and perfectly scheduled meetings insulated him from the chill outside. But now, he found himself driving across town to check on Sarah and Lily more often, sometimes bringing firewood or hot meals just to make sure they didn't feel the same cold he did. It wasn't just charity anymore, and he knew it. Something about being near them had started to fill the empty spaces in his life that no amount of money or achievement ever could. One Sunday afternoon, he arrived without warning, knocking softly on their door as snowflakes drifted down from the sky. When the door opened, Lily came running toward him, her small hands clutching his coat as if she had been waiting all day. You came, she exclaimed with a grin that made the entire gray afternoon brighter. She grabbed his hand and pulled him toward the kitchen. The smell of something warm and sweet filled the air, and he realized Sarah was cooking. She looked up from the stove and smiled, her cheeks flushed from the heat. You're just in time, she said softly. Lily insisted we make cookies today. They ate together at the small table, the kind of quiet family moment that Michael had only ever seen from the outside. Lily chattered about everything, her drawings, the neighbor's cat, the snow, and every time she spoke, Sarah's eyes filled with pride and exhaustion in equal measure. Michael watched them both, feeling a strange mix of warmth and ache. He didn't belong in their world, not really, yet something in him desperately wanted to. When Lily ran off to play in her room, Sarah poured 2 cups of tea and sat across from him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The sound of the wind outside filled the silence between them. Then Sarah looked up at him, her voice quiet but steady. You've done so much for us already, Michael. I don't know how to thank you. He shook his head. You don't have to, he replied. I didn't do it expecting anything. She hesitated, her gaze lowering to the cup in her hands. Still, she murmured, you've changed our lives. I thought people like you didn't even see people like us. That sentence lingered in the air, heavy and true. Michael leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on her. Maybe I didn't, he admitted. Not until I met you and Lily. He told her things he had never told anyone, about how lonely success could be, how every award and deal felt smaller than the silence waiting for him at the end of the day. You spend your whole life chasing something, he said, and when you finally catch it, you realize you don't even know why you were running. Sarah listened quietly, her eyes soft with understanding. Maybe, she said after a moment, you were supposed to stop running so you could find something else. He looked at her and felt that she was right. Days turned into weeks, and the bond between them deepened in small, unspoken ways. Michael started leaving his office earlier just to spend an hour at their home. Sometimes he helped Lily with her homework, though he was terrible at it, or read her bedtime stories until she fell asleep halfway through the page. Other times, he and Sarah would sit together after Lily had gone to bed, sharing stories about their childhoods, their regrets, their dreams. He learned that Sarah had once wanted to study art but had given it up to care for her sick mother. She learned that behind his calm, commanding presence was a man who had lost almost everyone he ever cared about to ambition. One night, after another long conversation, Sarah's hand brushed against his when they both reached for the same cup. It was a small, accidental touch, but it lingered. Their eyes met for a moment too long, the air between them thick with something unspoken. She looked away first, her cheeks flushed, and stood up quickly to clear the table. Michael didn't say anything, but as he left that night, he couldn't stop replaying that moment over and over. It wasn't just attraction, it was something deeper, something terrifying and tender that he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. But life, as always, had a way of reminding him that happiness was fragile. A week later, when he arrived one evening, Sarah wasn't waiting by the window like she usually was. Instead, Lily answered the door, her face pale and frightened. "Mom's not feeling good," she said in a trembling voice. Michael's heart dropped as he rushed inside and found Sarah lying on the couch, her breathing shallow, her skin cold. He called an ambulance immediately, his voice steady but his hands shaking. Lily clung to him, crying quietly as paramedics lifted her mother onto a stretcher. "It's okay," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "She's going to be okay." At the hospital, he sat in the waiting room with Lily asleep in his arms, his coat wrapped around her. Hours passed before a doctor finally emerged, explaining that Sarah's condition had worsened because she had been skipping her medication to make it last longer. Michael felt anger rise in him, not at her, but at a world that forced a woman like her to choose between surviving and saving money. "Do whatever it takes," he said to the doctor. "I'll cover everything." When Sarah woke up, she saw him sitting beside her hospital bed, exhaustion written across his face. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. He took her hand gently. "I couldn't be anywhere else." She tried to protest, but he shook his head. "You're not alone anymore, Sarah. I won't let you be." She looked at him for a long time, her eyes glistening with tears she didn't try to hide. And for the first time since they met, she didn't argue, didn't refuse help, she simply nodded, her fingers tightening around his as if afraid to let go. That night, as Michael watched her drift back to sleep, he realized that this was no longer just about kindness or guilt. He needed them as much as they needed him. In that sterile hospital room, surrounded by machines and quiet, something inside him shifted completely. For the first time in his life, the man who had everything understood what it meant to truly care about someone, and the terrifying responsibility that came with it. The days following Sarah's hospitalization were some of the longest Michael had ever known. He divided his time between the office and the hospital, though it was clear to everyone around him that his priorities had shifted. The man who once obsessed over deadlines and mergers now spent hours sitting in a sterile white room, holding Sarah's hand, reading reports beside her bed instead of in his boardroom. His employees noticed the change but said nothing. They had never seen him so human, so vulnerable, and perhaps that alone inspired more loyalty than any speech he had ever given. At night, after Sarah fell asleep, he would watch the steady rhythm of her breathing, his mind filled with thoughts he couldn't silence. He couldn't help but think about how fragile everything was, how easily life could unravel, and how much of his own had been spent building walls that kept real feelings out. Lily visited the hospital every afternoon, skipping down the hall with her little backpack, her bright energy lighting up the otherwise somber corridors. Nurses adored her, and doctors smiled whenever she passed, calling her the sunshine of the ward. She would climb onto the chair beside her mother's bed, hold her hand, and tell stories about her day as if her words alone could bring color back to Sarah's face. Michael often stood at the door watching them, feeling a strange ache in his chest. It wasn't sadness exactly, it was the overwhelming tenderness of realizing how much he cared for both of them. One evening, while Sarah was resting, Lily tugged on Michael's sleeve. "Can we get Mommy a present?" she asked softly. He smiled down at her. "Of course. What do you think she'd like?" Lily frowned in concentration, her little eyebrows knitting together. "Something that means she'll get better soon." That night, they went to a small flower shop near the hospital and picked out a single white lily. "It's like my name," she said proudly as she handed the money to the florist, determined to pay with her own savings from a small jar she kept at home. Michael tried to insist, but she shook her head. "It's for Mommy. I want to do it myself." When they returned, Sarah was awake, her eyes tired but soft with love. "For me," she whispered as Lily placed the flower on the table beside her bed. "It's perfect." She reached out to stroke her daughter's hair, then looked at Michael. "Thank you, for all of this." He shook his head, his voice low. "You don't need to thank me." But she insisted. "I do. You've done more for us than anyone ever has. I don't even know why." Michael looked at her for a long moment before replying. "Maybe because I needed to." As days turned into weeks, Sarah began to recover slowly, her strength returning bit by bit. Michael hired a private nurse to assist her after discharge and made sure the house was repaired and stocked before she returned. He didn't tell her how much it cost or how many calls he had postponed to make it happen. He just wanted her to come home to something safe. When she finally did, Lily ran from the car to the porch, squealing with joy, while Michael followed behind with Sarah's bags. Inside, the house felt alive again, warm, clean, and filled with light. That night, after Lily had gone to bed, Sarah sat on the couch wrapped in a blanket. Michael stood by the window, his silhouette outlined by the faint glow of the streetlights. "You've done too much," she said quietly. "I don't know how to repay you." He turned toward her, his expression soft but serious. "You don't have to repay me, Sarah. This isn't a transaction. I just want to make sure you're okay." She hesitated, then looked away. "People don't help like that, not without wanting something." Her words carried the weight of someone who had learned to survive disappointment. Michael moved closer, his voice gentle. "You're right. Most people don't. I didn't either, not before you." Sarah looked up at him, searching his face for any trace of insincerity, but there was none. What she saw instead was a man stripped of all his defenses, standing before her with nothing to hide. The silence stretched between them, fragile and charged. Finally, she whispered, "I don't understand you." He smiled faintly. "Maybe you're not supposed to. Maybe it's enough that I'm here." Over the following days, Michael became an almost constant presence in their lives. He cooked dinner when Sarah was too weak to stand, helped Lily with her schoolwork, and even fixed the old heater that had been broken for months. Neighbors began to notice and whisper, some curious, some disapproving, but none of that mattered to him. For the first time, his life felt real, messy, imperfect, and full of meaning. One evening, as they sat together watching the snow fall through the window, Sarah spoke quietly. "You know, before you came into our lives, I used to pray for just one good day. A day where I didn't have to worry about bills or sickness or what would happen to Lily if I couldn't wake up. And now." She trailed off, her voice trembling. "Now it feels like maybe I get to have more than just one." Michael reached for her hand, his fingers brushing hers. "You deserve more than that," he said softly. "Both of you do." But even as warmth filled the room, there was something else beneath it: fear. Michael could feel it gnawing at the edges of his happiness. He had spent his entire life controlling everything, ensuring that no one could ever hurt him, and yet now he found himself terrified of losing something he had never planned to find. He didn't know what the future would bring or how long this fragile peace could last. All he knew was that he wasn't going to let go, not of Sarah, not of Lily, not of the small, extraordinary world they had given him. That night, as he stood by the window watching snowflakes drift against the glass, he heard soft footsteps behind him. It was Lily, half asleep, clutching her stuffed rabbit. "Can you stay until morning?" she mumbled, her voice heavy with sleep. Michael smiled, bending down to lift her into his arms. "Of course I can." He carried her back to her bed and sat there for a while, watching her drift off. Sarah stood in the doorway, her eyes glistening. She didn't say anything, but their eyes met, and in that moment, everything they couldn't express was understood. Outside, the snow continued to fall, quiet and endless, blanketing the world in a stillness that felt like peace. Inside, for the first time in years, Michael felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. Spring came slowly that year, melting the last traces of snow from the sidewalks and replacing the biting cold with a soft breeze that carried the scent of renewal. For Sarah, every day outside the hospital felt like a small miracle. She was still weak, her body not yet ready to handle the weight of a normal life, but her spirit had changed. There was color in her cheeks again, laughter in her voice, and a kind of quiet determination that hadn't been there before. Michael watched this transformation with a mixture of pride and fear. It was beautiful to see her healing, but with that healing came the return of her independence, and part of him worried that once she was fully recovered, she would no longer need him. He told himself that wasn't why he was there, that helping her wasn't about being needed, but deep down he couldn't deny the sting of that thought. Sarah, on the other hand, noticed the way he lingered when he visited, how he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, and how he never quite seemed to know what to do with himself when she thanked him. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching Lily chase butterflies across the small yard, Sarah spoke quietly. "You've given us more than anyone ever has, Michael. You gave us hope again." He didn't look at her right away. His gaze stayed on the little girl laughing in the sunlight. "You gave that to yourself," he said softly. "I just happened to be here to see it." Sarah smiled faintly. "You make it sound easy. But you've changed too. You're not the same man who showed up in that business suit months ago." He turned to her, raising an eyebrow. "Oh. And who am I now?" She looked at him thoughtfully. "Someone who remembers how to feel." That simple sentence struck him harder than any deal or boardroom confrontation ever had. It left him silent, unsure whether to thank her or run from what she had just said. Their bond deepened as the weeks passed. Michael found himself staying longer each visit, sometimes falling asleep on the couch after reading Lily a bedtime story, only to wake up in the morning with a blanket draped over him, Sarah's quiet gesture of care. On weekends, they began to venture out together, taking Lily to the park or to small diners where she could draw on napkins while they talked. People often mistook them for a family, and though Sarah always blushed when someone called her Mrs. Collins, neither of them ever corrected it. The illusion felt too right to break. But happiness, as fragile as it was, never came without the shadow of doubt. One afternoon, Sarah received a letter from an old acquaintance offering her a full-time accounting job in another city. It was the kind of opportunity she had dreamed about for years, a stable salary, benefits, and a chance to rebuild her life completely. When she showed it to Michael, his heart sank even as he forced a smile. "That's wonderful," he said. "You deserve it." She nodded, but there was hesitation in her eyes. "It's far," she murmured. "Lily would have to change schools. And I don't know if I'm ready to start over again." He wanted to tell her not to go, to ask her to stay, but he couldn't. He had no right to make that decision for her. That night, as he drove home, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: fear of loss. He realized how much his world now revolved around them, how empty his house felt when their laughter wasn't there. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat in his office, staring at a picture Lily had drawn for him: a tall man, a woman, and a little girl standing under a bright yellow sun. At the bottom, in shaky handwriting, she had written, "My family." The word broke something open inside him. The next day, he went back to their house early in the morning. Sarah was sitting at the table with a cup of tea, the letter still lying beside her. "Have you decided?" he asked quietly. She looked up, startled to see him there, and shook her head. "I don't know what to do," she admitted. "It's a good job, but it feels like leaving everything behind again. I'm scared, Michael. I'm scared of making the wrong choice." He sat down across from her, his voice low but steady. "Sometimes the right choice isn't the one that makes the most sense on paper. It's the one that feels like home." She looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "And what if I don't know where home is anymore?" He hesitated, then reached across the table and took her hand. "Then maybe you let it find you." There was a long silence after that, filled only by the quiet ticking of the clock. For a moment, it felt like the world outside had stopped moving. Sarah's hand trembled slightly in his, but she didn't pull away. In the following days, the question of the job hung over them like a cloud. Sarah tried to focus on Lily, on her health, on daily routines, but every time she looked at Michael, the uncertainty returned. One evening, after putting Lily to bed, she found him standing in the yard, staring at the night sky. "I turned down the offer," she said quietly. He turned to her, surprise flashing across his face. "Why?" She smiled softly. "Because I realized something. I've spent so much of my life running, from pain, from fear, from the past. But when I'm here, with you, with Lily, it feels like I can finally stop." Michael didn't speak at first. He simply stepped closer, the distance between them shrinking until their breaths mingled in the cool night air. "Sarah," he whispered, "you don't owe me anything." She shook her head. "I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it for me. For us." That was the first time either of them had acknowledged what had been growing between them all along, the love that had formed not out of passion or impulse, but out of shared pain, quiet understanding, and the fragile beauty of healing together. He cupped her face gently, his thumb brushing against her cheek, and for a moment they stood there in silence, two broken souls finding comfort in the simplest truth: they had saved each other. When he finally kissed her, it wasn't dramatic or desperate. It was soft, careful, the kind of kiss that speaks of promise rather than possession. The stars above seemed to shimmer a little brighter, and for the first time in years, Michael felt that the world made sense. Inside the house, Lily stirred in her sleep and murmured something about a dream, unaware that the life she had unknowingly built for all of them had just changed forever. Later that night, as they sat together on the porch, Sarah leaned against his shoulder, her eyes half closed. "Do you think we'll be okay?" she asked softly. Michael smiled faintly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "We already are." The words weren't loud or confident, but they carried a quiet certainty that neither of them questioned. And for the first time in a long, long while, the future didn't seem like something to fear, it felt like something worth reaching for. Summer arrived like a long, deep exhale after months of holding their breath. The air was warm and golden, carrying with it the hum of cicadas and the laughter of children playing in the streets. The world outside seemed to mirror the quiet peace that had finally settled into Michael's heart. It had been nearly a year since he had first met Sarah and Lily, and sometimes he still caught himself wondering if any of it had really happened or if it was all some vivid dream that he was afraid to wake from. The once cold, sterile walls of his penthouse had been replaced with the gentle chaos of their modest home, Lily's drawings on the refrigerator, Sarah's laughter echoing from the kitchen, the smell of breakfast instead of coffee from a machine. For a man who had lived his whole life surrounded by noise but starved for connection, this new rhythm was nothing short of miraculous. Michael had reduced his workload drastically. The company practically ran itself now, though his absence had caused a stir among investors who couldn't comprehend why a man like him would step away from power. He didn't care. Every morning, instead of rushing to a board meeting, he walked Lily to school, holding her small hand as she told him stories about her teachers and friends. Sometimes Sarah would join them, her arm looped through his, and they would talk about everything and nothing, the past, their hopes, how strange it felt to be happy after so much pain. It wasn't perfect. There were days when Sarah's health faltered, when exhaustion crept back into her bones and she would try to hide it behind a tired smile. There were moments when Michael's old life tried to reclaim him, when the phone wouldn't stop ringing, demanding the man he used to be. But each time that happened, he looked at them and remembered why he had left that version of himself behind. One afternoon, while Sarah was baking and Lily was coloring by the window, Michael sat at the table surrounded by stacks of papers, not business contracts, but documents for something entirely different. When Sarah asked what he was working on, he smiled softly and said, "Something for the future." She didn't press, but there was a flicker of curiosity in her eyes. A few days later, he asked them both to come with him somewhere. They drove for nearly an hour into the countryside until they reached a quiet piece of land just outside the city, a green field bordered by trees, with wildflowers swaying in the breeze. "What is this place?" Lily asked, her voice full of wonder. Michael crouched down beside her. "It's ours," he said. "I bought it." Sarah stared at him, stunned. "Ours? What do you mean?" He looked at her, his eyes full of something deep and certain. "I want to build something here. A home, not just a house, but a place that's truly ours. A place where you never have to worry again." She shook her head, tears already forming. "Michael, you can't just," but he cut her off gently. "I can. And I want to. Not because you need it, but because I do. I've spent my whole life building things that didn't matter. This is the first thing that does." Lily ran ahead through the field, her laughter echoing in the open air, and for a moment the world seemed to pause. Sarah turned to look at him, her hand trembling as it found his. "I don't know what I did to deserve any of this," she whispered. Michael smiled faintly. "You existed. That's enough." They stood there together, the sunlight filtering through the trees, the wind playing with Sarah's hair, and for the first time, it didn't feel like two broken people trying to survive, it felt like two souls who had finally found home. Months passed as the house slowly took shape. Michael spent every free hour at the construction site, sleeves rolled up, helping where he could. Sarah often brought him lunch, sitting beside him on a pile of lumber while they talked about how they would decorate Lily's room or what kind of garden they'd plant. The workers grew used to seeing them together, the quiet man who was always polite and the woman who brought homemade sandwiches and lemonade. To them, it was just another project. To Michael, it was everything. By the time the house was finished, autumn had begun to creep in. On the day they moved in, Sarah stood in the doorway, unable to hold back her tears. The walls were painted in warm tones, sunlight streaming through the large windows. In the living room, a framed drawing hung above the fireplace, the same one Lily had made months ago of the three of them standing under a bright yellow sun. When Lily saw it, she gasped and turned to Michael. "You kept it?" He nodded. "Of course I did. It's where this all started." That evening, They had dinner together for the first time in their new home. The table wasn't anything fancy, roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, and Sarah's homemade bread, but to them, it felt like a feast. Afterward, Lily fell asleep on the couch, her small head resting on Michael's lap. Sarah sat beside him, her hand entwined with his, and for a long time they said nothing. Outside, the world was quiet except for the sound of crickets. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. "You changed our lives, Michael. But I think you changed yours too." He nodded slowly, his gaze resting on the sleeping child. "You're right. I thought I had everything before. But it was all noise. You and Lily, you're the reason I finally learned what happiness feels like." Sarah smiled softly. "You know, when I first met you, I thought you were the kind of man who could never understand someone like me." He turned to her, his eyes warm. "And now?" She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Now I know that maybe we were both just waiting for someone to remind us what love looks like." They sat in silence after that, watching the fire burn low, content simply to exist in that moment. Years later, people in town would often see the three of them walking together, Lily, now taller and full of life, Sarah, radiant and strong, and Michael, who smiled more than anyone remembered him ever smiling before. To outsiders, they looked like an ordinary family, but those who knew their story saw something extraordinary in the simplicity of their happiness. It wasn't built on wealth or status but on something far rarer: second chances, faith, and the courage to love again after loss. On a quiet evening long after the house had settled into routine, Michael stood outside watching the sunset spread across the horizon. Sarah joined him, slipping her hand into his. "It's beautiful," she murmured. He nodded, his voice low. "It is. And for once, I don't feel like I'm missing anything." She smiled. "That's because you're not." He turned to her then, and in her eyes he saw everything that had been missing from his life for so long: peace, belonging, and the unshakable truth that sometimes, the greatest riches come not from what you build, but from who you find along the way.